Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So he took a while to make up his mind which way to swing, but those campaigning for the UK to leave the EU will hope the deployment of their most charismatic performer, Boris Johnson, on the Marr show this morning will have the desired effect. The Mayor of London took a swing at the deal that Mr Cameron did with Brussels.
What we were told was that the stated government policy was that we should have a reformed EU, a fundamentally reformed, wholesale change in Britain's relationship with the EU was promised. That has obviously not been delivered. We were told at the time that Britain would be perfectly safe to walk away by the government, by the Prime Minister. That has now, that rhetoric has now very much been changed. And I think that was right. I think, by the way, the policy was right then. We should be absolutely confident about the future of this country.
Boris Johnson earlier this morning. So what do you make of his performance?
David Lloyd George said that negotiating with De Valera was like trying to pick up mercury with a fork. And I imagine Andrew Marr feels similarly after trying to pin down Boris on questions of Brexit. I mean, there was a particular bit of sketchiness on whether Britain would have access or should even seek to have access to the internal market in the event that we voted to.
The single market, yes.
Yeah, because if we did, that would seem to imply, as Wolfgang Schäuble said earlier on in the same show, that we would have to observe free movement as well. And if the Leave campaign don't have an agreement on something that fundamental, you can see them struggling when the real harsh light of scrutiny gets applied in the later weeks of this referendum campaign. I think what will end up happening is that there'll be a division of Labour whereby Michael Gove leads on the hard detail and interviews such as this. Boris Johnson does what he's good at, which is the retail politics. And you don't have incidents such as we observed during that interview, where I think there was a worrying level of confusion.
Wasn't it a less than assured performance?
I think the way that interview will be seen by those already in the Leave column is of Boris not being able to get a word in edgewise, being constantly interrupted, not being allowed to develop his points. And that will, I think, add to a sense of grievance, which is emerging as one of the features of this campaign, this debate. I mean, the Leave campaign are already complaining about Cameron overselling the deal, about sceptic cabinet ministers not having access to official documents, about Osborne lining up the G20, Cameron getting these European leaders to weigh in on the Remain side. And all that grievance narrative will probably be quite powerful when it comes to mobilising the debate, mobilising the base on June 23rd.
Wasn't he being interrupted because Andrew Marr was trying to get him to address the point? I mean, when you interview Boris, you have to do, not just Boris, but when you interview him, you've often got to interrupt, because quite often politicians just play for time in these interviews.
Well, often he was developing a particular point, and this is quite a complicated area. And whilst he was trying to develop a point and answer what Andrew Marr had asked him, he then sort of got interrupted. But I think that the general sense of grievance emerging amongst those on the Leave side will help mobilise the Leavers when it comes to the actual referendum. And the fact that the Leavers are already more engaged and energised and feel more passionately about leaving than the Remainers do about remaining will help the Leave cause, I think.
Helen, what did you make of it?
I think if that's the best defence you can give of Boris's performance this morning, that's quite worrying. He was terrifically waffly, and I agree with Janan. I think that Gove has played this much better. He actually seems to have answers to these big questions. There is a moment of extreme danger for Boris. What happens after the referendum, despite, particularly if we stay in? Does he take a cabinet job in which he would actually have to make hard decisions, things that would affect people's lives, people might stop liking him? Or does he stay and kind of moulder on the back benches looking kind of insurrectionist, but perhaps not making his move? I think he's in real danger. A lot of his popularity comes from the fact that he doesn't do politics. Being Mayor of London, he hasn't got an enormous track record to his name in that position. And when you're in a position where you actually have to make hard decisions that affect people's lives, people don't have a huge amount of tolerance for that hail fellow well met act.
Is there a sense of grievance on the Leave side, as Toby says?
Yeah, terrific, overwhelming sense of grievance. And you've noticed it even in the opening 2-week flurry of this campaign. You can imagine how much worse it will be later on. And things like Schäuble's interview, where he said that were Britain to leave, it could not count on access to the internal market. If it did have access, it would have to pay in, will be interpreted as bullying and as threats. I may think of it as an entirely rational set of behaviour by an institution that cannot create the incentive that if you leave, you get a favourable deal. But if you're on the other side of the argument, then of course you're going to see it as incendiary and provocative. My worry is that the campaign will actually get quite poisonous, and that the opening 2 weeks is reflective of something much worse.
It'll get worse.
by June.
Janan, if this grievance narrative begins to gain traction over the course of the campaign, won't that actually help mobilise the Leave side? We've seen how grievance narratives can mobilise voters in America with Donald Trump.
But there was a terrific amount of grievance in September 2014 in the Scottish referendum, and I think it gets you to 35, 40, touching 45%. To win a plurality, I think you need to go beyond grievance and absolutely nail the hard-headed arguments about economic
Well,
risk.
that partly depends on turnout, and if the public are turned off by the negative tone of the debate, then you'll have a low turnout, and a low turnout will probably favour Leave rather than Remain.
I agree.
We shall see. We're only 2 weeks in. Long way till June the 23rd. We relish every week of it, every day, every hour.